presenter for the morning is Dr. Sana Iqbal. Sana recently earned her PhD in cultural geography from the Center for Arts, Memory, and Communities at Coventry University. Her presentation's title is Understanding Satpanthi Ginanic Compositions Using an Ecocritical Lens. Sana, take it away.
Thank you so much.
Mute.
I hope everyone can hear me. In the benefit of time, I would also like to dive in. So from the Book of Animals written by Al-Jahiz, popularly called as Kitab al-Haywan, to the popular 20th century poem on the Himalayas written by Allama Iqbal, there have been a continuous fascination with the natural environment among Muslim thinkers. Let me start by briefly stating the objective of my paper, which is to study Satpanthi Ginans using the lens of eco-criticism to understand the relationship between humans and nature, as well as the nuances of environmental ethics embedded in them. I argue that a sense of unity between humans and the natural environment is promoted in these Ginans, which imbues a sacred reverence for nature, as well as a sense of responsibility towards ecology. I will now start by briefly setting out the historical and the cultural context of Satpanthi literature. There is a lot of unpacking that needs to be done, so let me start with briefly explaining what Ginans are and how eco-critical thought is relevant here. For those not familiar with this literature, Ginans form the religious literature of Satpanthis, who are a denomination of Shia Muslims from the Indian subcontinent. So we are talking here about a rich body of literature, which started as an oral tradition and is now kind of estimated to be over 1,000 compositions of varying lengths, written in various languages, mainly Gujarati, but there are also words from Hindi, Sindhi, Punjabi, Saraiki, Farsi, Arabic, and other languages. These Ginans are claimed to be authored and composed by preacher saints, popularly known as peers, who used the language and themes that were vernacular to enhance the effectiveness of their message in the subcontinent. I am therefore employing the term Ginans for Satpanthi Ginanic literature from 12th to 19th centuries as a useful descriptor here. Just to clarify, the use of figurative language in this literature has been widely studied for their appropriation of indigenous Hindu, Islamic, and Sufi discourses. The literature in the last few decades has also been studied from multiple perspectives, but there is still a scope to study it from using the different lenses, such as the literary theory of eco-criticism, which is attempted here. So what is eco-criticism? Basically, eco-criticism started in response to this age of heightened environmental crisis as a literary and cultural theory based on ecological thinking with a level of commitment to activism. To use Derek Gladman's words, who has written extensively on eco-criticism, it is a broad way for literary and cultural scholars to investigate the global ecological crisis through the intersection of literature, culture, and the physical environment. It can also be defined as an earth-centric approach to literary studies as opposed to anthropomorphic or a more human-centered approach. The variety of scholarship on this subject area, especially since the 1990s, shows that it has been widely studied, ranging from, let's say, the nature-inspired poetry of William Wordsworth to the concept of self in comparison to non-human animals in the mystic poetry of Bhai Singh and others. Although many Ginans make use of animal symbolism, in order to achieve the objective of this study, I'm going to focus on the verses that can serve as a basis to make us understand the relationship between humans and the environment. So I'll be focusing on two key themes here, starting with the first one, which is around bridging the human-nature divide. As you're aware that there's a growing divide between man and nature, which constitutes as one of the main obstacles to sustainable development in the present times. As opposed to an anthropocentric ideology or worldview, which promotes human-centered power structures, where human beings are given the central position and all other creatures or entities are pushed to the margins, I argue that nature is not in the backdrop for setting a scene or working to fuel the imagination of the poet or the reader in these Ginans. One such example that I have taken from a Ginan titled Ugamia Sohide Natamia, translated here on the slide, is very relevant here. I would perhaps like to read it as well. The jasmine began to wilt, the drawing rope snapped. The bullocks came to a stop. Gone was the water, gone was the drawer of water. Millionaires, crown princes, millions of them are gone. At one time ruling the realm, seated in high balconies. One can see here that this poem is making use of the motive of life and death, which encompasses both nature and society, or what can be called reweaving the nature-culture divide. The intention is to break away from this duality between man-made and natural environments and to remind humans of the finite nature of our lives. At another occasion, this liminality or blend of natural and man-made environments is also evoked by using the metaphor of a garden for the human heart, such as in the Ginan titled Mahe Varse Amrat Noor, where it is advised to remove the roots of evil deeds and purify the heart, remove wild plants, and set up a fence of the pangs of separation. Here one can observe a more pronounced earth-centric approach, without letting go of the theme of human consciousness, since the human heart is being symbolized as a garden to be planted with good deeds for it to flourish. When looked at from an ecocritical lens, the inward-looking essence of this word, which yet draws ecological symbol, implies on the one hand that there's a whole world inside the human heart too, but on the other hand, it portrays the external world as a reflection of the human soul and consciousness, like a mirror, blurring the distinction between the two. This is not to say that the outward world is not worthy to be taken care of, but rather to break away from that polarity between the two worlds and present the human heart as a reflection of the natural world, thus implying the unity or the harmony between the two. Another theme, which is kind of building upon this, upon the current one, is around the theme of environmental stewardship as set out in Ginans. Here I would like to bring another example from a Ginan titled Dur Deshanti Ayo Banjaro, which is translated as slandering others causes the ruin of the universe, and from head to feet, the person regenerates to hell. As set out here, the decline of human values has a bearing on both humans as well as the natural environment. This argument not only gives agency to nature, that is, nature turning hostile to humans if being disregarded, but also blurs the distinction between what is physical and spiritual by warning us about the decline in human values, which has an impact that is manifested in nature. This decline, caused by the non-adherence to the teachings of the divine spirit, causes the ruin of the universe, thus equating environmental stewardship with spiritual awakening. This simply shows that although humans are in charge of the planet, with this responsibility comes accountability too. Such ethics and imaginings of stewardship are reflective of the Quranic notion of man as a vicegerent or khalifa on earth, having the responsibility to safeguard the planet and show reverence for all other creatures. It is thus not just a matter of choice, but a moral and religious obligation to conserve nature and act responsibly to safeguard both physical as well as spiritual worlds. In conclusion, the heavily metaphorical language of Satpanthi Ginans present a very culturally attuned concept of oneness, beautifully and effortlessly signifying the notion of bridging the man-nature divide fostered in eco-critical thought. Drawing on examples from this literature, one can see that nature is not just at human disposal to serve them. For such an interpretation will not do justice to the religious thought and imagination out of which Satpanthi literature was born. Rather, the content analysis of the text briefly presented here shows that there is a strong critique on the duality of man and nature and a thirst for fluidity, which also questions and supersedes the worldly and spiritual binarism. The theme of oneness between spiritual and worldly lives is evoked by these peers or poets, which, as opposed to contemporary thought, does not necessarily require the subordination of environment to, let's say, economic growth. It rather situates human as a conserver of both material and spiritual worlds. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you so much, Sana. Yes, as always, go ahead and unmute anybody if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi, can I ask quick question? So I'm sorry, I have two. So one is, I'm wondering about the contemporary role of the Ginans. Like, where is it taught in practice? Like, is it like in schools, or how is it kind of, yeah, like basically, where is it now? And the second, kind of related is a question about space. And since you're a geographer, I'm wondering about kind of how the Ginans are spatialized. Like, do people kind of like, you know, like go into, you know, enact this in certain ways, or how is it kind of like reaching across space and time? So I'm just wondering about the kind of material components of what you're presenting.
Yeah, that's a really good question, to be honest. So first of all, Ginans, as I mentioned, that they form a body of literature, and these are kind of like sung as a ritual practice among, you know, Ismailis or Satpanthi Ismailis as well these days. So it's still alive as a tradition, as a, you know, and not just that ritualistic aspect, but it also serves to kind of, you know, bring that sense of community, or to kind of, you know, it allows those individuals who are kind of singing it or kind of, you know, using it for ritualistic practices to kind of feel associated with that sense of community, because it kind of reminds them of their traditions and, you know, about their history. And so, yeah, so it's still very much alive as a practice, and it's being studied widely. So some of the themes around bridal symbolism, for instance, some of the themes around animal symbolism or bird symbolism, you would find all these themes. And yeah, so these are kind of very, kind of still relevant, I would say, to present times. In terms of the geography, I think it's, I mean, you have to kind of understand the sort of the cultural geography of subcontinent to be able to understand these sort of, you know, Ginans. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of fluidity, and this fluidity is kind of representative of the culture as well. So, you know, there's a lot of borrowings between Sufi practices, some forms of like Hindu mythology and these Ginans, and you would find that, you know, there's a lot of parallels, but there's a lot of kind of ways where you can see the geographical kind of, you know, aspects to it as well. So how when I say peers, I meant like, you know, the poets who are kind of attributed to have written these poems, how they kind of migrated from Persia to subcontinent and brought the message of, you know, Satpanthi Ismailism. And then in these Ginans, you would find instances of many different cities as well. Let's say Multan, or, you know, Sharif, which are kind of very prominent historic centers of both Satpanthi Ismailism as well as, you know, Sufi practices as well. So you would find a lot of nuances, I would say, when it comes to, you know, yeah, when it comes to geographical, you know, descriptions as well. I hope I was able to answer your question.
Sana, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, especially that your topic is related to mine somehow. So appreciated your contribution. I just have one question. So when it comes to sometimes Sufi practices or other minority practices, you see a lot of references to different kind of environmental problems or issues, or even like a relationship with the environment. But they actually don't use it in a very explicit way. It's kind of internalized in their behavior, in their practice, and the way that they show it to others that you can see. And as a people, we can say outsider, when we look at it, we can understand these things. I just want to ask this question, is it the same approach over there? Like you as a scholar could figure it out, or no, it's very explicit and they talk about it in the community? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question. It makes me think, because I am also a part of the community. So my positionality is also something that I would perhaps should have kind of, mentioned here. I don't think it's kind of widely talked about in terms of, if let's say, if I would say in terms of environmental ethics and in terms of, all these ecological symbols that that I've kind of mentioned in my presentation. But I do think that it's kind of a way of thinking or a kind of interpreting the text that is there. And there can be multiple ways. So as I mentioned that, let me kind of phrase it this way, that using an eco-critical lens is something that is kind of very, I would say, a contemporary way of looking at the literature, which is kind of pre-environmentalist and, which is kind of, yeah. So I think it is just like, I would say it's not as embedded in the community itself as well, but there is a lot of emphasis on, let's say, environmental sustainability. And it's all about making all those, important connections, I think, here. And of course, as a scholar or as a reader, you would want to see all those connections happening in, when people also talk about these. But I would say that there's still a need to kind of, there's still a need. There might be an underlying sort of argument, or there might be an underlying concept in the minds of people though, but there's still a need to look at the literature with with this lens or any other sort of, which can allow us a more informed understanding, I would say.
Thank you.
Once again, I think we have time for one more quick question before we have to sign off. If anyone's got a lingering question. My question's a bit more general. I was wondering how you think a more general audience could use an eco-critical lens. What's a good starting point to jump into this mindset?
Yeah, so I have been reading quite a lot about eco-criticism, and I think a good starting point would be not to kind of, think about it in like very sort of, historic ways. Because I think there have been, like, for instance, at least 3 waves of eco-criticism till now. And kind of, I would say a good start would be to start with the challenges that we have in the contemporary times, and then try to see how this cultural theory or literary theory can allow us to look at the literature in a with a very different perspective. But of course, it's just, I would say, one way of looking at it. So there might be multiple ways of looking at the literature. And there are, like, I would say people who have written extensively, like, Derek Gladwin. Then there are some Indian scholars as well. So people have kind of adopted the idea of eco-criticism to make it more relevant to their context as well. So a good starting point would be to kind of start with, let's say, reading one article from Derek Gladwin, but then, having somewhat like, a more contemporary lens to it. And, because when I was doing this research, I came across papers where they have kind of, studied not just like William Wordsworth or Shakespeare using an eco-critical lens, but even some of the I would say, like, not like less famous, but somewhat like, well, not as recognized poets as well. And I'm sure this is not the right term, but what I'm trying to say here is like those papers or those kind of, contributions could really allow us to see what it entails, first of all, to use an eco-critical lens, and why is it important, and how it can be sort of, used to study a body of literature.
Great. Thank you so much, Sana.